know, when we were talking about diatoms, I was reminded of this forensics case that I saw on the show Forensic Files.
Mm-hmm.
This boy was murdered, and he was drowned. And so how they caught the killer was they actually studied the species of diatoms that he'd ingested, and actually found those species in the suspect's car.
Wow.
When he moved the body.
That's pretty cool.
And like they compared the species living in different bodies
And they
of
realized
water.
it was pretty distinct.
And yeah, they realized it was a very distinct community living in that body of water where he was drowned. So that's very fortunate.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a sad case, but it was interesting the way that they were able to end up solving it and getting justice for him.
There seems to be more and more of that these days. Yeah, where people are just taking advantage of all kinds of. You leave a signature everywhere you go, everything you do.
Yeah, but it's getting harder and harder to commit murder.
I know. If only we had lived in a different time period.
One suspect was caught because the plant pods that were found in his truck bed were genetically the same as the plant pods of the tree that the victim was found under.
Huh.
Like it was Palo Verde trees, and they sequenced the DNA of hundreds, I think maybe even thousands of Palo Verde trees, and only that one tree had the same genetic signature as the tree material found in his that fallen into his truck.
Wow.
It's crazy.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. Full time. No, it's Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
You know what I find funny about evolution? Is that dinosaurs evolved to
Somewhere it shows like a T-Rex and a chicken. dinosaurs.
Probably not well equipped.
Okay, let's start back up. So chapter 29 is one of two chapters about plants. Yes, they had to fill two chapters. So the first chapter, 29, deals with all of the seedless plants, both non-vascular and vascular seedless plants. Chapter 30 deals with all of the seed plants, so gymnosperms and angiosperms.
How plants colonize land. That's
Yeah.
basically what allowed invertebrates to colonize land. Or vertebrates.
So, we know that the plant lineage, unlike green algae, plants are monophyletic. So if you are a plant, you are more closely related to all other plants than you are to anything else, including mushrooms. Okay? So plants are a lineage embedded among the green algae, right? They evolved from green algae. Their ancestor was a green algae. Okay. And the ones that we're going to talk about today are mosses and other non-vascular plants. And unlike gymnosperms and angiosperms, mosses and a lot of other non-vascular plants, they have an alternation of generations, but they spend more of their life cycle as a gametophyte than they spend as a sporophyte. So let's talk first about their evolutionary origins. Okay, so nowadays there are roughly 290,000 species of living plants that have been described so far. Most of those, the overwhelming lion's share of those, are angiosperms, or flowering plants, which are actually pretty new to the scene. So we didn't see flowering plants until the Cretaceous, which, if you think about it, is bananas, right? That's really recent. But the lineage of plants goes back much, much further. Okay, so plants are considered terrestrial, right? Which is why you often hear them described as land plants. Okay, but there are actually descendants that have gone aquatic again, just like there are aquatic mammals, right, whose ancestors were terrestrial. So there are lots of seagrasses, for example, and those are plants. Okay, when we're talking about land plants, we are not including the green algae in that description. Okay, but green algae are their closest relatives, and specifically the charophytes. Okay, so how do we know that charophytes and not chlorophytes were the most recent, or are the sister taxon to the plants? Well, we know that charophytes share the following three features with plants that no other green algae do. Okay, so in addition to molecular evidence, right, we know that the proteins that they use to synthesize cellulose fibers occur in these rings that you see pictured there. But in other green algae, it's actually linear. Right? Really weird thing for them to have in common, but that's often the case. Right? Your book mentions the structure of flagellated sperm. Doesn't mention any specifics about what that structure is, but just says that they look kind of the same. Okay, and then the final one is the formation of a phragmoplast. And a phragmoplast are just these little microtubules that kind of assemble between dividing nuclei during mitosis. So figure in here is just depicting phragmoplast here. All right, so before we go to the next slide, think about this for a second, right? You're a plant. You need water for photosynthesis. Or I guess you're a green algae. Let's start back further. You're a green algae. You need water for photosynthesis. Why would you ever go to land? What is on land that is possibly better than an aquatic environment for you? Sorry, what was it? Okay, yeah, so there's not a lot of competition yet, right, from other algae or plants. Yeah, sunlight's a huge one, right? You get a lot more sunlight. What else? You get a lot more CO2, right? If there's excess CO2 in the ocean, it bubbles out just like it does in your Coca-Cola bottle, right? But you can get a lot more CO2 in the air, no problem, okay? So those are the big draws, right? And eventually, right, because there are cyanobacteria and lichens who have come before you, there are actually a surprising amount of nutrients available, and there's already soil on the land. Okay. So really, as a land plant, you just need to solve a couple of problems, and like the going is great on land, right? You've got great sources of sunlight, lots of CO2, lots of nutrients in the soil. You just have to figure out how to get those nutrients to you, and you have to figure out how to deal with water availability, right? So water scarcity is a big problem, as is lack of structural support, right? So if you're just floating around in the ocean, right, you don't need to be as rigid, right? And it's easier for nutrients to come to you. Okay, so the first major adaptation that you see among green algae is present in charophytes and plants, and it's a protein called sporopollenin. Okay, and this is just conferring desiccation resistance onto a zygote. Okay, so it's basically preventing the zygote from drying out. Not even going to talk about that. So here is the phylogenetic context of plants, right? We've got karyophytes. We've got lots of different lineages of karyophytes. And then all plants fall into this. Sometimes plants are called embryophytes. It's another word for plants. Anybody know why? What an embryophyte is? We'll talk about it. So we've got things that they have in common with karyophytes, right? Now we've got things that they don't have in common with anybody else. Okay, so these are the 5 traits that you find in all plants that you don't find in karyophytes, right? AKA, these are the only reasons that we call plants plants. Okay, it's because they have alternation of generations. So here's a fun fact, right? You don't see alternation of generations in other multicellular green algae. They have multicellular dependent embryos. So the sporophytes, the diploid part of the life cycle, for a time depends on nutrients from the gametophyte. More on that later. Spores are produced in this space called the Sporangia. And the structures that make the gametes and hold the gametes are multicellular. They're called Gamete Pangea. And we will go through examples of all of these, so these don't have to make sense yet. And then finally, we've got apical meristems. So basically, plants have stem cells that can differentiate, basically, both in the root systems and in the stem, right? So if you look at the very top, maybe you have apple trees or anything in their backyard. You have to like prune apple trees, otherwise they just get too difficult to harvest from. So if you, after you prune an apple tree, you can see that there are these shoots that shoot like straight to the sky, right? At the very tip of those are apical meristems, right? So it's basically you snip things, and then somewhere else there was a node that had another apical meristem, and it just started differentiating into a new branch.
Is that like plum trees when they have like the shoots that are like 5 feet away from the tree?
Yeah. So basically, if it, yeah, you can have root apical meristems that can then differentiate into above ground tissue. Sure would be nice if we had that, right? Just chop off a finger, grow a new mark on the end of my hand. That'd be cool. Or terrifying. Okay. All right, so we'll talk about alternation of generations first. So plants alternate between, and I like bolded and italicized the word multicellular there. So they alternate between two multicellular stages, and that's why it's called alternation of generations. The first stage is haploid, and it's called a gametophyte. Okay, so gametophytes themselves, multicellular, but they're not gametes yet. They're just plant part. Okay, but some of those cells can become gametes. They don't have to undergo meiosis because they're already haploid, right? They just have to undergo mitosis with some fancy gene expression changes. Once you get those gametes fusing together, you get a diploid zygote, okay? And once that zygote divides by mitosis, it becomes a sporophyte, a multicellular diploid. Okay? That sporophyte, some of those cells have fancy gene expression changes that change them into spores. In addition to undergoing meiosis. Okay, so spores are haploid. They've gone from diploid to haploid, which always involves meiosis. Okay, so in humans, we're used to thinking of meiosis as leading immediately to the formation of gametes. But in plants, those are actually separate stages of the life cycle. Right, so you get meiosis, get spores. Spores grow into a whole new multicellular gametophyte before they form gametes. Every single plant is like this. So different plant lineages emphasize those very differently. Once we get to angiosperms, we'll see the gametophyte is like extremely reduced and is microscopic. So you basically can't see it. But in the plants we're going to talk about today, the life cycle is dominated by the gametophyte phase. Okay, so this is just like a comic or a cartoon example of like what a typical alternation of generation life cycle might look like. So they've drawn a fern here, but this could be any plant. So let's pick a place to start. Let's start at the zygote. Right? So something just had sex, there was a zygote. Multiple rounds of mitosis lead to this individual, which is a sporophyte. Every cell in this whole organism is diploid. Okay. In some parts of that tissue, those cells are undergoing meiosis and forming spores. Each one of these spores, they don't have to fuse with another spore, right? If you just isolate one single haploid spore, that will grow into a gametophyte. So this is a multicellular organism. Okay, eventually the gametophyte will make cells that are gametes, and those gametes can then fuse and form a new zygote. How are we doing? You guys okay? Okay, so that's alternation of generations. Now we've got multicellular dependent embryos. Okay, so when that sporophyte initially forms, it's forming within the tissue of the gametophyte. And interestingly, there is nutrient transfer here. So there is a dependence, right? A sporophyte can't grow unless it's getting nutrients from its gametophyte. I hesitate to call it a parent. Okay? So there are cells in that gametophyte that are called placental transfer cells that are facilitating that nutrient transfer. Right? So here is the embryo. So this is the sporophyte. And here's the maternal tissue. This is all what? Give me a 1 for haploid, 2 for diploid. The blue cells. The haploid or diploid? Haploid or diploid? Blue cells. Mixed bag. Okay, they're haploid. Right? So this is the gametophyte. The maternal tissue is the gametophyte. This is the new sporophyte, which is diploid. Okay. So, right, again, it's harsh out there on land, right? It's dry. Maybe you don't have immediate access to nutrients if you're just a tiny little embryo. So it's super helpful if you get nutrients from your gametophyte parent, from your maternal tissue. Okay, so this is why plants are called embryophytes. It's because every plant has this, where they depend on nutrients from the gametophyte to start off life. Okay, so the sporophyte, which is what? 1 haploid, 2 diploid. Sporophytes. Are diploid. Gametophytes, which sound like gamete, are haploid. Right? Sporophytes are diploid. Okay, so sporophyte produces spores. Are spores haploid or diploid? Haploid or diploid? Haploid. Right? Are gametes haploid or diploid? Of course, they're haploid. Yes. Okay. So anytime you're growing into a new multicellular thing, whether it's a sporophyte or a gametophyte, nope, that's not true. Never mind. Take it back. Okay. The sporophyte, which is diploid, produces spores, which are haploid, in organs called sporangia. So this is a single sporangium. Okay, this isn't a moss. Okay, and in that sporangium, you have some tissue that's diploid, everything in blue, and some tissue that's haploid, which are the spores themselves. Okay, so you might look at that on a moss and be like, oh, that's a spore. That's not a spore. You're not going to see a spore with your naked eye. What you're looking at is a sporangium. It's basically a spore container.
What about the orange powdery stuff underneath the leaves of a fern? Are those spores?
Those are sporangia. Yeah, so, well, they're actually a unit even bigger. We'll get to that.
I know that like fungus is not a plant,
Yes.
but is that the same like with mushroom spores? Like, is that their sporangium that you see with the naked eye? Where to take like a spore from?
I read the fungus chapter this weekend.
Okay.
And I don't even remember whether they're called Sporangia or not, but I think they are. But we'll get there. I'll know better when I have to lecture about it. Okay. So the cells that undergo meiosis are called sporophytes. Right? Anytime you see site, just think cell. Right? Sporo, diploid. Right? So it's a diploid cell that's undergoing meiosis to form spores. And what's the name of that protein on the spore walls that makes them resistant to harsh conditions? Sporopollen. Yes. Okay. All right. Next feature shared by all plants, no matter what kind of plant, are Gamete Pangea. Okay, so these are basically like special organs on a plant that store the gametes. And there are two different names depending on whether the gametes are the sperm or the egg. Okay? If the gametes are an egg, that Gamete Pangea is called an archegonia. Okay, gonia, anytime you see something with a G, I always associate that with female. If that Gamete Pangea, right, that multicellular gamete storing organ, stores sperm, that Gamete Pangea is called an Antheridia. Okay, anther, right, probably, if you know anything about flower structure, you should already be thinking that's a male structure.
It sounds like antlers.
Yeah, antler, androgen, okay, these are all sort of male kind of things. Okay, so again, we've got archegonia is the female Gamete Pangea, and Antheridia is the male Gamete Pangea. Okay, when we get to talking about seed plants, some seed plants have actually lost their archegonia and Antheridia. Okay, but here you can see it. This is a liverwort. So this is the gametophyte of a liverwort. And then part of the sporophyte of the liverwort has a Gamete Pangea. Right, in this case, it looks like it's an archegonia, which has eggs underneath it. Oh, sorry, just kidding. Those are both Gamete Pangea.
They have separate plants, or can they grow off the same?
It depends on the organism. So most mosses either have one or the other. I don't know about liverworts. All right, another thing all plants have in common, right, is they have apical meristems. So this is an apical meristem of a shoot. So this is the above ground tissue, right? And this is basically, these cells can differentiate into whatever. So they keep their stem cells at the tip, right? Whether that's the tip of a root or the tip of a stem, doesn't matter. Okay, so here's a picture of the root system that also has the apical meristem. Okay, so let's pause here. I'll give you like a minute or two, grab a piece of paper, grab a partner, and try to write as many of the 5 features shared by all plant lineages from memory if you can. If you need to look back at your notes, of course, do that. But try to do it from memory to get a rep of that first. And I'll collect these just for participation points.
Alternation of generations.
We got part of it. And then what's this like? What's the word for plant? Walled spores contained in.
So mushrooms do produce their spores in the sporangium unless they're asexual spores and they come from their conidium. What's it called when plants produce zoospores? Where's that come from? Zoospores? Oh, that's how you say it. Alright, so that might not be plants, that might be something produce. That's a form of asexual reproduction,
So do we have to like go into detail about?
Just list the 5. Yeah. Yeah. You look new. Are you okay? Yeah. You, Melanie. You. I know it's a lot. I'm sorry. Like, I don't. Yes. Yeah. So basically, you have all kinds of samples to look at, and you're just like working through all these examples of things to try to be able to recognize them.
Okay, cool. So that's what we're doing in lab
For the next 3 weeks. It'll be really fun. It's actually like supposedly pretty low key, pretty relaxed. So.
I did that for an
Really?
I just remember sitting there like holding a skull in my head, just like naming each of the tiny bones on it. Ooh, yeah, my sister's in
I retained almost nothing.
Lainey's going into nursing, so she's in the
That actually sounds like a lot of fun to me.
Yeah, well, no, it's fun, but it's stressful because then you also have like all of the bones in the hand, all of the bones in the foot.
It's a lot.
All of the muscles and like the spine and the arm. It's a lot.
Yeah, I feel like
Most of the time you get out of it.
Anybody still working? Raise your hand if you're still working on this. Okay. All right, so somebody give me one of them. Alternation of generations. Somebody give me another one. Melanie.
Dependent embryos.
Dependent embryos. Connor. contained in the sporangia. Yep. Carmen, give me another one. Gamete Pangea. Yep. Yep. And then who wants to give me the fifth one? Somebody give me a fifth one.
The Apical Meristems.
Apical Meristems. Okay, so definitely know those. Okay, and additional optional features for a plant. Okay, not all plants have these, but some plants, many plants in fact, have a cuticle, right, which is a waxy covering in the epidermis. Why might it be in the interest of a plant to have cuticle?
So it doesn't lose water in the heat.
Bingo, right? So basically it helps retain water. Some plants have stomata, right, which are specialized cells that allow or facilitate gas exchange. Why would you want to facilitate gas exchange as a plant?
Isn't it for like the desert plants so that oxygen and CO2 doesn't build up within the cells?
Right. You need oxygen as a plant, right, if you're doing photosynthesis. And you don't want a lot of carbon dioxide around. Does anybody remember why having a lot of carbon dioxide around is a bad idea?
It's like an equilibrium, chemical equilibrium. If you have too many products, then you can't produce more.
So that's part of it, right?
Is it the other, I can't remember the name, but the thing that confuses
Mix of oxygen and
Oh, yeah. The enzyme
carbon
called rubisco. Yes. Right? So the reason is because rubisco's, yeah. You guys should take a group test. No, that was beautiful. That was beautiful. That's how human knowledge works, right? You guys are a living internet. That was wonderful. Okay. All right. So stomata, by the way, stomata are not just in like hot, dry dwelling plants. You have stomata in other plants as well, right? They're facilitating gas exchange even in more pleasant environments. Okay, mycorrhizae, right? So that you see that word myco, and what do you think? Fungus. Yeah, no, good enough. I'll take it for now. All right. So mycorrhizae are basically fungi that associate with root systems, or sometimes even if the plant doesn't have root systems, not every plant does, by the way, they're just facilitating nutrient exchange. So there are literal mycorrhizae associations where the fungus will infiltrate individual plant cells, right? So they will stick their hyphae into a plant cell and facilitate nutrient exchange, even at that fine of a microscopic level. Okay, so are these all shared derived traits for all plants? These three? No. These are just added bonus features. Okay. We'll talk more about mycorrhizal associations when we get to the fungus chapter. Okay. By the way, so flowering plants, right, angiosperms, which we'll talk about next week, or maybe I'll make a video of that this weekend. They're pretty recent from the Cretaceous, but we know that there were plants as old as 470 million years ago. We have fossils of plants. Okay, so these are 450 million-year-old fossils, but we have fossilized spores and we have fossilized sporophyte tissue from plants. Why somebody knows that those are plant spores and why that's plant tissue is a wonderful question that I don't know the answer to. Okay, but somebody is an expert enough to be able to tell you why those are plants. Okay. You also have fossil sporangia. Right? So this is a sporangium. I know it looks like a mushroom, but really this is just an organ that stores spores, plant spores. Okay, and this fossil is from 425 million years ago. Okay. So you're about to see a table that has plants sort of categorized in a couple of different sections. And on the right-handmost side of the table, you're going to see different numbers of species in each of these clades. So take a look at the variation here. Okay, so on the not too many species alive end of things, you've got a phylum of gymnosperms, Gametophyte, that has exactly one extant species.
Ginkgo biloba.
Yeah, so all ginkgos are Ginkgo biloba. And does everybody know the story behind those? Well, somebody else I'm sure does. What was it?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay,
It's
sorry.
its own file. It's crazy.
It's its own phylum, yeah. That doesn't happen very often, right? It's the only extant species in the phylum. So basically, all ginkgo individuals, which we have on every neighborhood sidewalk now, descend from one individual that was found in a Chinese monastery a couple of centuries ago. So there's literally one individual, or maybe it was a stand of them. There were just a couple, and all ginkgos are from that monastery. Right? So we almost lost an entire phylum, right, to modern history. Okay, meanwhile, take a look at the angiosperms. Okay, we've got a whopping 250,000 of the, 290,000 total species are flowering plants. So flowering plants clearly are doing something right? They're tremendously successful clade. Okay? Another really successful clade we've got are the Manilophytes. Does anybody know which subgroup of Manilophytes are most of these species? The hint is that these are seedless, vascular plants. They don't make seeds, but they have a xylem and phloem. They have vasculature in their tissues, so they can get tall.
Trees?
Good guess. Those are mostly angiosperms, some gymnosperms.
Ferns.
Okay, so there's a lot of diversity among ferns, a lot of diversity among mosses, surprising amount of diversity among liverworts, given that I didn't know what liverworts were until I was in college, so maybe that's true for you guys too, I don't know. Yeah, so there's quite a few of those. All right, so we are focusing on these guys and these guys today. And these guys are all next chapter. Okay, so if you want sort of this data as a phylogenetic tree with pictures, you got it. Right. So here are all of the plant lineages, right? And the most basal branching lineage, right, the one that has had the most independent evolutionary history are the liverworts. Okay. So liverworts are plants. They are land plants. Okay. And along with mosses and hornworts, they are categorized as non-vascular.
What's a common liverwort that you would see a lot, if there are any?
I don't know them by name. I wouldn't be able to take you out and be like, that's a liverwort. But if you're going to find liverworts, they're going to be in places like the Pacific Northwest, right? So they, yeah. So, well, so, right, here's an interesting question, right? You see all of these non-vascular plants occurring more often in moist habitats. Why might that be? What about water?
Like it.
Yeah, so do these guys, but what can they do?
They can transport water upwards.
Exactly, right? So they have root systems that they can conduct water through vascular tissue, right? Mosses and liverworts don't have vascular tissue, so they're just like, I guess we'll work with the water that's right around us, right? So that's why you see a lot of these guys in places like the Pacific Northwest. Okay, I'll see you in 10 minutes. I still haven't decided what I'm going to do with the remainder of the plant chapters that we're supposed to cover this week, but chances are good I'll just record and post those videos.